research.
So, Bruchim Habayim, welcome on behalf of Bethel and on behalf of the JCRC to this special evening in which you get to hear from the editors and authors of Bound in the Bond of Life, Pittsburgh Writers Reflect at the Tree of Life Tragedy, which I believe is coming out literally just in the next few days, right? So I was... I couldn't help but notice as I was reading through this early copy that each chapter of the book opens with a picture. I don't know if all of you can see this of a tree, and the symbolism is obvious. The tree of life, although it doesn't look much like a living tree. Its leaves have all been stripped bare. And I was reminded of a teaching in Pirkei Avot that describes a tree that has faced very strong winds. And a tree, of course, whose roots are very shallow can be uprooted and easily blown over. But even if the wind is incredibly strong, even if it strips all of the leaves from the tree, if the roots are deep, then the tree will not be toppled. Well, as Jews, we've faced over the millennia many, many storms, but Torah, Jewish tradition, and Jewish community have provided us incredibly strong roots. Well, in their book, Dr. Beth Kissleff and Eric Lidji share words of Torah and provide insight into the community of Pittsburgh. They tell us about the roots that have held, even in the face of the tragedy of the Tree of murders. And in the process, they deepen all of our roots and prepare this tree to blossom forth once again. Many of you know Beth Kissleff from the years she and her husband John, Rabbi Perlman, lived here in town. I count her as a friend and someone who on Thursday night at 10 o'clock, if I needed to borrow an egg, she was just 2 houses down, and she was up getting ready for Shabbat, and I was getting ready for Shabbat, so I knew that I could always call and walk over. Beth is the author of the novel Questioning Return and the editor of essays in the book Reading Genesis Beginnings and Reading Exodus Journeys. She's taught at universities in Pittsburgh and Minnesota and Carleton, Smith, on Holyoke, and her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, in The Times, in Tablet, in many, many news outlets. And we're delighted, Beth, for you to return along with Eric Lidji. I hope I'm saying your last name correctly. Lidji. Lidji, thank you. Eric is the director of the Rau Jewish History Program and Archives at the Senator John Heinz History Center. He's the author and editor of several works, such as Her Deeds Sing Her Praises, Profiles of Pittsburgh Jewish Women. He writes extensively about the Jewish history of Western Pennsylvania and hosts the local Jewish history podcast, The Cornerstone. He's been overseeing the effort to preserve documentation of the October 27th attack. And so we're really honored to have both of you here, and again, to share with us the process of really creating those roots and revealing those roots to not just the Pittsburgh community, but really to the Jewish people and beyond.
Thank you. Beth, do you want me to kick it off?
Yeah.
So thank you all for having us tonight. It's a little strange to be doing these events in other places without leaving home. My wife tonight said, "Where's your program tonight?" And I said, "Minnesota." And she said, "What? You're going to Minnesota?" So I want to start with a book that I discovered over the summer that I feel like really captures the sense of what Beth and I were trying to accomplish. I actually have it here. It's by Simon Wiesenthal, and it's called Everyday Remembrance Day. And he wrote it in the 80s. And what he did was he went through hundreds of volumes of Jewish history, and he found incidents of every single day on the calendar where there had been some sort of deadly anti-Semitic incident. And as you go through the book, on each day of the year, he lists these, and you you see these sort of clusters in Portugal or in Eastern Europe or in the Middle East or in other parts of Europe. And as I was going through this book this summer, I was so horrified and frustrated by it. Horrified because it really lays out the scope of what deadly anti-Semitism is. And frustrated because it's a book about death. And it's not a book about Jewish life. And specifically, it's not about the interplay of how Jewish life meets with Jewish death. And in the past 2 years, the thing that I have found to be the thread of our lives here in Pittsburgh is the sense of what is the responsibility of those people who are still alive after something like this. You know, we're coming off of the high holiday season, and the sort of culminating prayer of that season is the Unatana Tokef. And that prayer is all about the sense of impossibility when it comes to knowing what's going to happen to somebody in the course of the year. But underpinning it to me has always been this sense of responsibility, that if you have made it to another Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, that in some sense you've been asked to continue your mission here on earth. And I think what Beth and I were trying to accomplish was some sense of looking at what life is like in the aftermath of something like this, and trying to get a sense of what happens when the life of a vibrant community comes up against something that's so horrible. And what we did was we went to as many different writers as we could find in the community. I say as many as we could find. We didn't nearly come close to as many as we could find. We selected a certain number, but there could have been so many more. And we gave them a very simple assignment. We said, we chose you because we know that you have some emotional connection to this event. And we're giving you a certain amount of words, and we trust you to do something special with it. And that's what we got. We got our friends and our neighbors and to write about their experiences in trying to navigate the aftermath of this attack. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to read, Beth and I are going to trade back and forth reading selections from the book. And we're following the basic structure of the book, which I'm going to let Beth talk about because she had a greater hand in sort of envisioning what that would look like. But I'm going to start with the first essay in the book. It's called Here is Squirrel Hill. And it's by a writer named Molly Pascal. She's a freelance writer who's written for many national publications, but she comes from a big classic old Jewish Pittsburgh family, and specifically a Squirrel Hill family. And for those of you who don't know, Squirrel Hill is a very unusual Jewish community in America. It's really outside of Manhattan and Brooklyn, it's really the only urban Jewish community that did not depart for the suburbs. We have suburban communities here, but Squirrel Hill has been the urban Jewish center of Pittsburgh for almost a century now. And there's something that is incredibly particular about the experience of being Jewish in Squirrel Hill, and she's trying to capture a little bit of what that is. Pittsburgh is not so much a city as an amalgamation of neighborhoods formed by immigration and migration. Italian Morningside and Bloomfield, Black Hill District and Homestead, Irish North Side, and so on. While time has softened those definitions and borders, there remain impervious pockets. About 4 miles east of downtown lived the vast majority of the area's Jews. Here is Squirrel Hill, an urban shtetl so natural and commonplace that I never knew it was a shtetl. It is pickles and babka and rye. It is statuesque oaks, maples, and London planes clipped in compromise for the electric wires. It is kosher pizza and donuts. It is busy at 7 a.m. with morning minion traffic. It is 13 congregations of 4 denominations in 2 square miles. Walk another mile and you get another 2. The outdoor Chanukiah is permanent, not one seasonally affixed to a chassid's car. It is a public clock rendered in Hebrew. Little hand on Aleph marks the hour, steeple high over the Jewish Community Center. At the age of 6, I ventured up street alone for the first time, following a 2-block urban trail from my parents' home on Marlborough Road to Carnegie Library and the candy store. The shortcut required a shimmy past dilapidated garages, then a trespass along the deteriorating condos where Forbes Terrace used to be. The condos had been renovated, the garages torn down. Now, at 46, I walk the same old route. Progress slows at the hiss of a 61C. I slip around the knot of Oakland-bound international students. Then I'm forced to stop. I wait, like I've always waited, at a sacrosanct square, the 4-way walk and compass points of all who call this home, the intersection of Murray and Forbes. A flash of white, a high-pitched beep, then we all go at once, right, left, diagonally. One driver has violated the double line, but a pedestrian pushes him back with a punishing scowl. On I go, passing stores, coffee, bikes, candy, books, bagels, banks, bars, ice cream, and restaurants, Lebanese, Taiwanese, Japanese, Thai, Indian, Greek, Turkish, Mexican, pizza, pizza, pizza. I see geriatrics inching toward the Imperial House, lines and pancake gridlock at Pamela's, flocks of yeshiva girls in long navy skirts, strollers battling for sidewalk space, hipsters seeking vintage clothing or vinyl LPs, modern Orthodox boys shooting hoops, trailing seat like spaghetti, cognoscenti at the Manor Theater, revelry on Simchat Torah, parades on Yom HaAtzmaut, and silence on Yom Kippur. It is our way to describe places by what came before. That's where Isley's used to be, by the old Poli's, where the old Foodland was. Perhaps even more remarkably, everyone understands. Used to be is our geography. It is the semantics of belonging, the archaeology of sedentary generations, and the rhetoric of an insular people. For newcomers, the young and progressives, this attitude can be frustrating and off-putting. But it also speaks to a community who, though slow to pledge, are loyal once they do, who are not so much resistant as cautious with the heart. In Squirrel Hill, you are always someone's granddaughter or grandson, son or daughter, mother or father, cousin, coworker, doctor, neighbor, or friend. My pediatrician's son became my nephew's pediatrician. We gave birth to our children at McGee. We buried our grandparents, then our parents at Sugars. My daughter will go to school where I went to school, where my mother went to school. My childhood friend is the school nurse. My second grade class photo hangs on the wall in her office. When we meet someone new, we interrogate. Do you know so-and-so? How about so-and-so? No? Well, you should. We welcome the stranger, but hasten to dispose of that title. If New York bestows the gift of loneliness, Squirrel Hill wards against it. Intrusion and concerns are its gifts. To live here requires participation, whether you like it or not. New Yorkers are created every day. We require a lifetime.
Okay. Thank you, Eric. So that was the title essay in the volume. So as Eric mentioned, the volume is divided into 3 parts. The first part, Here is Squirrel Hill, is named after Molly's essay. And her essay is a play on E.B. White's Here is New York. And it's a section that contains essays that are descriptive in some way of Squirrel Hill. So we have Molly's essay leading off. We have an essay by a journalist who lives 400 feet from the Tree of Life building, and someone that ran out of the synagogue, ran into her home, and she was very much immersed in covering what happened and also feeling it personally. She writes an essay about that. We have an essay by an African-American newspaper columnist at the Post-Gazette who talks about anti-Semitism as well as other kinds of hate that he personally has experienced. I was really shocked to read how much hate mail he gets as a columnist at our local newspaper. And we also have an essay I'm going to read by a Minnesota native. So it's actually funny. She was born in Pittsburgh, but then she moved to Minnesota, I believe, Wayzata. I remember having a discussion with her about it, and some of you know the name of Haman's 10 sons, and Wayzata sounds very much like Vaizata, so sort of that's how I remember Wayzata. But she is a convert to Judaism, which she writes about in her essay. And I'm going to read that essay now. It's called Pittsburgh Positive, and I'm just going to read her bio. Her name is Brooke Barker, so maybe some of you know her. She's a writer and illustrator and author of the New York Times bestselling book Sad Animal Facts and the book Sad Animal Babies. Her work has been translated into 9 languages, and she's a contributor to the New York Times, The Stranger, Lenny Letter, and The Guardian. So I'm going to read Pittsburgh Positive by Brooke Barker for you now. In October 2018, I had a note on my phone that I'd look at a few times a day. Between the note for potential dog names and the note for invention ideas, why is no one making tiny pieces of jerky you can shake into your palm and eat as a snack? There was a note entitled, The Future. My husband, Boaz, and I knew we wanted to move sometime in the future, but we didn't know where, and the note on my phone was a list of cities. The future kept me up at night and made my phone feel like it weighed 5 pounds. We were living in Amsterdam, but we've been flying back to America every other month for work or for family, and as much as we loved our life in the Netherlands, it seemed like it might be time to move. We've researched American cities with public transit where we could afford an apartment with a laundry machine and where we could hopefully be a part of a Jewish community. This last part was confusing to our friends in Amsterdam, almost none of whom were Jewish. We were members of a synagogue, a short bike ride from our apartment, but as much as we loved listening for vocabulary words in the rabbi's talks, and even though the Kiddush always included great coffee and milk chocolates, it wasn't quite the Jewish community of our dreams. There were only 3 other members under the age of 60, and the Dutch Jewish community was pretty insular. It took 2 years to get a Shabbat invitation. So in October 2018, we looked at the list for the last time and we chose Pittsburgh. We started looking at apartments in Squirrel Hill and we came up with a family mantra, Pittsburgh Positive. Becoming Pittsburgh Positive meant acting like we already lived in Pittsburgh. We had only a loose sense of Pittsburgh geography and had never heard the word yins, but we streamed Pittsburgh local news on our TV in Amsterdam. We read about cookie tables. We picked favorite local sports teams. Boaz chose the Penguins and I chose the Pirates. Friends learned not to get us started on Rick Seaback, libraries, Duolingo, inclines, or the beautifully designed Connect card. Even though we could spell Pittsburgh, we could barely spell Pittsburgh, it felt like home. So on October 27th, when news of the attack in Squirrel Hill reached us and everyone else in the world, we reeled not just as people and as Jews, but also as Pittsburghers. We mourned from 6 time zones away with the people we didn't know yet, and we cried for the families of the people we wouldn't get to meet. It felt almost selfish to feel as sad as we did for a city that wasn't our home yet, but we felt like Pittsburghers too. In Amsterdam, our synagogue was guarded by 2 police officers and a volunteer college-age guard. There was a different guard each week, and when they discovered how bad my Dutch was, they'd switch to English. I don't think you've ever been here before. I don't recognize you. Boaz went early to services to avoid all this, and he walked breezily into shul after greeting a man named Raul. But I don't like going early to services, so every week I had a long conversation with the guards. My luck changed on my birthday when the rabbi sent me a signed card, which I started bringing to services every week. If I've never been here before, why do I have a birthday card signed by the rabbi? I'd say, and the guard wouldn't ask any more questions. It rains a lot in Amsterdam, and I wanted to get the birthday card laminated so that it wouldn't get damaged, but Boaz said that was weird. On our first Shabbat in Pittsburgh, just a few months later, I worried that the city we'd felt positive about for so long might not have room for us. Would a community in the midst of mourning be ready for newcomers? But in synagogue, when the rabbi announced to the congregation that we had moved here, we got a standing ovation. That afternoon at Kiddush, and that month around the neighborhood and around the city, we finally met the people we daydreamed about being neighbors with for so long, and they were all as friendly as we'd imagined. Now that we do live in Pittsburgh, people sometimes ask if I'm from here. If I'm feeling sneaky, I can tell them I was born here. It's true, but it's misleading. My parents went to grad school at the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon, and I lived here for a few months before I had teeth. I can pretend to be a native, but for most of my life, my relationship with Pittsburgh consisted of writing its name on forms. I'm a Pittsburgh convert, and I'm a Jewish convert too. When I tell people I'm Jewish, it feels equally misleading. I can't play Jewish geography and don't have a good answer for what my parents are doing for Rosh Hashanah. I feel as lucky to have found Judaism as I feel to have found Pittsburgh. As a shy person, being Jewish helps me turn a city into a group of neighbors and friends. As a nervous person, being Jewish, it's what makes me brave enough to speak up when it's important. And best of all, being Jewish makes me feel like me. It feels like something I was meant to be all along. As a Pittsburgh Jew who hasn't always been a Pittsburgher or Jewish, it feels like my life has finally settled in the way it was always supposed to be. Sure, I may still picture a bird every time someone mentions the local grocery store giant eagle. I may never pronounce Monongahela with confidence, but the Pittsburgh Jewish community is my community, and Squirrel Hill is full of my squirrels. Every week at synagogue, I listen as we read the names of the people murdered on October 27th. I'll never get a chance to spend time with these 11 Pittsburgh Jews, but since moving here, I have heard so many warm memories from those who did know them. Last October, we attended a memorial at Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall with people who now really are our neighbors. We cried again for our friends and for the families of the neighbors we will never get to meet. In a bizarre turn of events, a photo slideshow that played as we walked in showed half a dozen photos of the dog we adopted when we moved here, which we named Kip. The photos had been taken that morning as we biked with other volunteers to deliver cookies to first responders, and our dog tagged along comfortably in a backpack. We'll never get to know Pittsburgh exactly as it was before we moved here, but I'm honored to be part of its future. Thank you.
So the next section of the book is called Finding the Vessels, and it comes from a drash that was given by a rabbi on the Shabbat following the attack. If you know your Haftorahs really well, you know that the Haftorah for Parshat Chayesara, I believe it is.
Vayera.
Vayera, the one after.
Chayesara, the one after, right.
Is the story of Elisha and the jars of oil, where there's a woman who's very destitute, and Elisha comes and gives her a small jar of oil and tells her to fill up all the vessels in her house. And as soon as she does, the oil runs out. And this rabbi was saying that there's an infinite amount of divine comfort and chesed. The problem is finding the vessels to contain it. And he went through this long list of the vessels that were to be had in moments like this, everything from prayer to family to Torah to Jewish history.
To Shabbat.
And Shabbat. And the essays in this section of the book are about people trying to find those vessels in their life. And they range from a woman who is very passionate about Argentinian tango to the piece that I'm going to read now, which is by a writer named Adam Shear, Dr. Adam Shear. He's a professor in the Jewish Studies Department at the University of Pittsburgh. And his field of expertise is medieval Jewry. And so what he did was he wrote an essay about the origins and nuances of a lot of the mourning customs that we all know so well, but maybe don't understand where they came from. But he interwove it with his own personal history with these rituals as a Jew. And then his experience over the past, at that time it was the past year, of watching the Jewish community navigate these same rituals as well. He's talking here, I'm going to start sort of in the middle of a thought. He's talking here about the mourner's Kaddish and the idea that some people, the people who are saying it always stand, but there's a debate within various congregations about whether other people should stand or sit when others are reciting the mourner's Kaddish. So he begins this way. I'm a sitter. Maybe it's because I'm lazy, but when I rationalize it, I think that there is something special in being a mourner. The mourner performs an obligation. I am not obligated. Jewish tradition is torn. Extra piety, the technical term is supererogation, is welcomed by some, others look on it with suspicion. On November 3rd, 2018, the Shabbat after October 27th, when the large sanctuary of my synagogue, a few blocks from Tree of Life, was packed with more than 1,000 Jews and non-Jews, with members of the three congregations, we were all asked to stand as one for the mourner's cottage. This to me was moving and not supererogatory. Many synagogues have a custom. At each daily, Sabbath, and holiday evening and morning service, when it comes time for the mourner's cottage, someone reads the names of those whose anniversary of their deaths are being commemorated that day on the Hebrew calendar, the yard site. For a full year, many synagogues in Pittsburgh also read the names of the 11 martyrs in daily or weekly commemoration. I felt tempted to rise when I heard those names, but I didn't. Who am I to claim to be a martyr? But I marked the names. I noted the names, and that is something.
Okay, so I'm going to read another selection from an essay in that section, which, as Eric said, is called Finding the Vessels, and there are a variety of essays. Some of the essays contain poetry. My husband, with two other rabbis, wrote a poem meant to be read on Yom Kippur for the Eila Ezkara for the martyrology section, which is he based his around the Akedah, which is Genesis 22, which is the portion that was going to be read that day and was never read by those in the three synagogues. And there's another, also I haven't mentioned yet, we made sure to include essays by members of the three synagogues. So there's two essays by members of New Light Congregation, Eric Congregation, two essays by members of Tree of Life, which Molly is, the first essay that Eric read, and two essays by members of Dor Chadash, the Reconstructionist congregation. And one of the members of Dor Chadash wrote some poems, which if you buy the book, I think that's a wonderful chapter. And I've read that in the past, but I decided tonight, since this is a synagogue and a Jewish audience, I'd read an essay called The Day They Honored. So Shabbat is the day that they honored. And it's about this author's observance of Shabbat and how her experience of finding out the news, unfolding the news, and her not using electronics on Shabbat impacted her that day. So I'm going to read excerpts from two different sections of it. And so this is by Susan Jacobs Jablow. Susan Jacobs Jablow is a Pittsburgh-based journalist, essayist, and grant writer. She's a former staff member of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and the Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle, and her work has been published in numerous other publications. She's a graduate of Yeshiva University's Stern College for Women and the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Every Saturday morning, with rare exceptions, I walk to shul for Shabbos morning services. Like many Jews, despite my best intentions, I'm often late. That's what happened on October 27th. I left the house around 10 a.m. to walk to my synagogue, Shari Torah congregation. Because our family strictly observes the traditional laws of Shabbos, we don't ride in a car or use electronics from shortly before sundown on Friday until after dark on Saturday, a 25-hour period. Our synagogue is about a 15-minute walk from our house. When we left our house that day, the sirens had already begun, but it was easy to dismiss the first few as routine emergencies. Perhaps someone had fallen or there was a kitchen fire. The farther I walked, the sirens grew in number and intensity. By the time I reached Murray Avenue, vehicles with sirens blaring were streaming past me and my two children, racing to an unknown emergency. There were ambulances from suburban EMT crews and unmarked cars with darkened windows and dashboard lights. The top brass. Something truly awful had happened. But because it was Shabbos, when I don't use electronics, I had no way of knowing what was going on and no way of contacting my husband, who was already at services. People were beginning to step outside storefronts on Murray Avenue to see what was happening, simultaneously checking their phones for information. I was tempted to ask a stranger for information, but I was also afraid to know. My synagogue was my intended destination, and I felt an urgency to get there, knowing my husband would worry if I didn't make it. And I knew that in gaining a bit of information about the unfolding events, I would be distracted from focusing on Shabbos. The concept of strictly observing Shabbos to intentionally disconnect from the world, even though we remain immersed in it, is foreign to many people, including many Jews. Unlike some religious sects, most observant Jews don't isolate themselves in rural communities or generally proscribe use of technology. 6 days a week, we fully embrace technological advances and are as addicted as anyone else to our internet-connected screens. And most of us live within urban or suburban communities closely connected to civic events and the local effects of world news. But one day a week, we cut off this contact in exchange for a sense of peace and contentment and the opportunity to escape. We pause from the world to rest and reflect so that we can re-enter it 25 hours later with renewed vigor and increased insight. In Jewish tradition, Shabbos is referred to as a taste of the world to come, that is heaven, but it's also a fragile state of being in this world. In one's home or synagogue, Shabbos is a totally immersive experience that offers warmth and joy. We set aside our weekday preoccupations to sing, pray, eat, rest, and engage with time in a more fluid way. There are no appointments or meetings or sports practices to quicken our pace. However, to maintain this atmosphere of holiness requires effort. Walking down a bustling commercial street or becoming involved in mundane activities can break the spell because it's so easy to fall into patterns of those around us who may be spending money, talking on phones, or running errands. These distractions can cause one to forget that the day is holy, a time sanctified and apart. Stopping to ask for information about the unfolding emergency on October 27th would interrupt my observance of Shabbos while increasing my fears. In addition, the people around me didn't seem concerned for their own safety, so it didn't seem necessary for personal protection to find out what was happening. Instead, my children and I pressed on. We weren't denying the reality of what was happening around us, just recognizing our helplessness to affect it and choosing to immerse ourselves in the spiritual comfort of Shabbos. When I entered the synagogue, the shul president was standing in the vestibule, and I approached him to ask if he knew what was going on. There has been an incident at Tree of Life, he said. He didn't offer more details, and because my children were present, I didn't ask for more. I wondered first if there had been a bomb or arson, not able to imagine there had been a shooting. Then I wondered if the attack had been personal in nature. Again, I could not initially conceive of a random hate crime. After we arrived at our synagogue safely, it became clear that it was the best place for us to be that morning. A handful of members with security training had already secured all the doors, and the non-Jewish custodian was checking local media and staying in touch with 911 dispatchers to ensure the congregation was not in danger. We had the information we needed without totally shifting our focus away from Shabbos. The custodian gave our rabbi updates throughout the service, and the rabbi made announcements to the congregation. Despite the horrific news, the services continued, and the bar mitzvah boy who had trained over many months beautifully chanted his Torah portion. As the news sank in, I felt myself gripped with fear. I struggled to focus on the prayers. We did not know yet that the gunman had acted alone or that he had been contained at Tree of Life. We worried that our synagogue, packed with more than 300 people present for the bar mitzvah, could also be a target. I became Shomer Shabbos strictly observant in my late teens. From early childhood, I'd been raised to observe many of the traditional rituals of Shabbos, but would still ride in a car or use electricity. Through the influence of cousins and an Orthodox youth group, I learned about laws that prescribe those activities and felt drawn to the beauty of adhering to Shabbos more strictly. I saw that the parameters of these laws, while demanding, created a warm, joyous, and peaceful atmosphere. Since then, I have not generally found them to be that difficult to follow. Once I disconnect before candlelighting on Friday afternoon before sunset, I put the burdens of the outside world on hold and feel a sense of relief to focus on family, comfort foods, Torah study, and rest for 25 hours. However, there are notable times when this disconnection has been unnerving. On October, and I'm skipping to another part of the essay, the last part. On October 27th, I sat with my children and talked to them about the information we then had and how it made us feel. I was able to listen to them with their many questions about how such a thing could happen. My daughter, who was 9, kept asking why the gunman had got into a synagogue to kill people and why he had chosen that particular synagogue. I had no answer to these questions, but I was able to sit with my children, verbalize my own inability to understand what had happened, and show them that our life had not been irretrievably shaken. It was still Shabbos, and we were still observing it as we always did. Despite the upheaval in our community, this was a bit of stability to cling to. Keeping Shabbos and maintaining its rituals for our family was the most psychologically healthy decision we could have made that day. We were fortunate not to be directly affected, and we were not in a position to assist those who were. Like most members of our community, we were on the periphery, feeling the shock and fear, even though we had not been in the Tree of Life building. As I thought about it later, I realized that our determined observance of Shabbos was also an act of defiance. The gunman, like other violent anti-Semites throughout the ages, had been bent on not just killing us, but attacking a house of worship and desecrating our religion. That morning, 11 holy souls had been deprived of their ability to celebrate Shabbos. In keeping the holy day, I was carrying on their legacy, ensuring that the day they honored would not itself become a casualty of violence.
The final section of the book is called "You Will Get Through It," and it comes from a phrase within the last essay in the book, which is written by a woman who was the director of our local Holocaust Center for many years. Her parents were survivors, and her daughter was murdered by a total coincidence on October 27th, but many decades ago. And when she told her parents about this awful thing that had happened, her father said to her, "You will get through it." And it seemed to us like a sort of perfect encapsulation of the proactive nature of a certain kind of Jewish resilience that faces these tragic events by taking on some action. So I'm going to read from an essay by Abby Weiss-Schachter, who is a research fellow at Carnegie Mellon University, but also a writer. She's the daughter of Ruth Wise. And she's writing about how when the attack happened, she was in Manhattan at the time and had a sudden feeling that she was in the wrong place, both spiritually and physically. This is from the middle of the essay. In the fall of 2001, I was at my office in Midtown Manhattan when I learned that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. When it became clear that something besides a terrible accident was going on, I called my parents, who were then living in Boston, to let them know to turn on the TV news. I told my mom, now maybe they'll understand what happens in Israel. What I meant was that Americans might have a bit better understanding of what it means to have terrorists who reject your very existence, attack civilians and symbols of your power in order to cause the greatest degree of bloodshed and fear. It seemed very possible that by having experienced such devastating carnage, Americans might appreciate even more strongly the struggle that the Jewish state had been dealing with since its founding. At the time, the outpouring of patriotism, pride, and love for America was heartening and strengthening. And indeed, for a while, there were those who became more hawkish about national security because of the 9/11 attacks. Some years later, I learned that along with those Americans who had responded to 9/11 by joining the military or rededicating themselves to public service, and those Jews who, like myself, became even more committed to a forceful foreign policy and support for Israel, some American Jews had another response entirely. They became more Jewishly observant and committed to tradition. I heard of a man who decided after the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon to only marry a Jewish woman, which he did. Someone else I met opted to only eat kosher meat. Still others started to wear a kippah in public or to the office. I have to admit, before the shooting at Tree of Life, I didn't get it. The attacks of 9/11 weren't motivated by anti-Semitism after all. I couldn't see the connection between terrorist attacks on US soil and Jewish commitment. Truth be told, I'm not sure I see it any better now. Funnily enough, I know I have friends and acquaintances who don't understand my decision to observe Shabbat more strictly by not driving. After all, I did not make this commitment as some kind of punishment for having broken Shabbat the morning of the shooting. The opposite is the case. I have chosen to celebrate and affirm my Judaism in the face of one man's attempt to destroy as many of my fellow Jews as he could. Observing the responses of other friends and Jewish Pittsburghers to the Tree of Life attack, though, I can see how my decision to walk might not seem logical.
Okay. So, one thing I want to say before I read the last essay in the book that Eric mentioned called You Will Get Through This, is that we were very intentional about inviting a variety of people to contribute to the book. We asked a number of non-Jews. I mentioned an African-American newspaper columnist here in Pittsburgh. And then we have a reporter for the Post-Gazette and a national reporter for the New York Times who's based in Pittsburgh. And the last two essays, non-Jews write about Jewish teachings that they've learned by being around Jews. And that's something that's very powerful to me. That it's possible for our teachings to communicate our ideas to a wide range of people with a wide range of experiences, and then it can mean something. Our teachings can mean something to people from a wide variety of backgrounds. I also want to say we're reading essays that are sort of intentionally hopeful. This essay that I'm reading is by a woman whose daughter was murdered 29 years before the Tree of Life shooting, and she talks about her message of resilience. There's also an essay by someone whose sister was murdered when the sister was in college. My friend was in high school, randomly attacked on a college campus. And my friend has certainly gotten through the last 40 or so years, but it's not hopeful in the same way. And I think one of the things that we tried very hard to do in the book is to show that there's a wide range of ways that people react and a wide range of human emotions. And, it's very important for people that are grieving or coping with trauma in any kind of way to do what feels comfortable for them. There's no one size fits all way to deal with grief. And that's one of the many reasons why we wanted to do an anthology, was we really wanted to show the variety of ways that people cope with grief, and perhaps give people permission who've dealt with some kind of grief or trauma to think more and work through their emotions more if they haven't felt they can do that up to this point. And, I think the last thing I wanted to say about the anthology as a form, Eric and I have both, along with, I know, Alexander. Are you still doing Daffy on Me, Alexander? You're still? All right. Irvine was too much for you. Okay. Well, Alexander was doing Daffy on Me for a while, but we both independently have been studying a page of Talmud a day since January. And, the Jewish form, the Talmud doesn't have one voice that says this is correct. And the Talmud is very much full of a variety of voices. And for Jews, truth doesn't come through one voice. It comes through being able to hear a variety of voices. So it was very important to us to kind of showcase a variety of voices. So I'm going to read the last essay by Linda Hurwitz. Linda is the former director of the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh from 1988 to 2005. Under her supervision, the all-volunteer project with many local Holocaust survivors produced the book Flares of Memory, Stories of Childhood During the Holocaust, published by Oxford University Press, edited by Anita Brostoff with Sheila Shambowitz. Linda was an English teacher and head of the middle school at Community Day School for 10 years, and a teacher at Carnegie Mellon Osher Lifetime Learning and other adult programs at Chatham College and at the University of Pittsburgh's Informal Studies program. Should we go to services for Karen's yahrzeit this morning? My husband asked me on the dreary morning of October 27th, 2018. It was 29 years on this exact date since our precious daughter was murdered right in our backyard. Karen had her bat mitzvah in the chapel of the Tree of Life Synagogue on May 4th, 1985, her 13th birthday. She chose the intimate setting. She was a shy person, sensitive and serious. She liked to read and was a wonderful writer. Being an only child, she sometimes found it hard to take the teasing of her peers and often wound up being taken advantage of because she trusted others and wanted to help them. I remember the beautiful wood and charm of that synagogue, full of caring friends and family and teachers from Community Day School who knew her well. At Shabbat dinner of October 26, 2018, with friends and family that knew her well, we shared good, sweet memories of Karen. My mother, a 97-year-old Holocaust survivor, recalled Karen working as a hostess in Eden Park, a local restaurant chain, during her senior year, and how proud she was to have her grandma see her in her uniform. A dear friend whose children grew up with Karen remembered preparing Karen for her college interviews at Emerson College and Boston University, helping her choose what to wear, and putting her on the plane just 3 weeks before her death. As part of her application, Karen had written about her summer internship at WQED, the local public television station, working for Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, and how she loved to write and hoped to pursue journalism. I recalled how excited Karen was to go to the Cheers Bar and Restaurant after the Boston interviews, as she loved the TV show. Her aunt and uncle added memories of Karen enjoying their 3 children who grew up just around the corner from us. We all knew we would never forget that date, October 27, 1989, when Karen was brutally strangled and stabbed to death. This year, 29 years since our lives were broken by the brutality perpetrated on her, we chose to remember finer times. We went to bed trying to focus on the long ago images, on her goodness as a young woman with college applications on her desk and her future still ahead of her. Now, it was a month since we had all been together in the sanctuary of Tree of Life for the High Holidays. During the Yizkor Memorial Service, we'd each reflected on those who were no longer with us. On this Saturday morning, I felt sad and tired, and the reality of the forever loss of her and her future made me feel listless. This bitter taste had me feeling lethargic. Thus, I had not gotten dressed yet. My husband went up the street to put air in his bike tires and said that when he returned, we could decide if we felt like going up the 4 blocks to Tree of Life for services. On his way home, he saw police cars and heard sirens in our neighborhood. When we turned on the TV, we were shocked. Our Tree of Life was under attack. It was incomprehensible that where we had been just weeks before, fellow congregants were being murdered. I pictured us all seated together, enjoying the high holiday services midway down the main sanctuary. I pictured Joyce Feinberg handing me the prayer book and Irv Younger telling people when to be ready to come up for an aliyah. I recalled hearing and meeting this new Rabbi Jeffrey Myers, trying to get to know his new congregants. Now he was being thrust into the line of fire. Like the Tree of Life murderer, Karen's killer brought his weapon, intent on violence, out of his own meaningless, distorted rage. For the rest of us, it's impossible to imagine that kind of violent intent toward good, innocent people. Even having studied the unspeakable torture and brutality of the Holocaust, when violence happens to someone you know, in your home, in your world, you gain only a fraction of understanding of what others have experienced. You learn, like I did from the Holocaust survivors I knew so well, that each of us has resources deep within us that will surface to give you the strength to go on with life. In response to this call I had to make, my parents, knowing from their own suffering and survival that we have a strong will to live, said, "You will get through it. You will get through it." My mother was born in Lodz, Poland, to a large, very educated, financially comfortable family. Her father was the oldest of 7 siblings and her mother one of 8. My mother was adored by her parents and grandparents and even had great-grandparents growing up. She believed that if you were loved and fortunate enough to have happy, secure, formative years, you had the self-assurance to rebound when you had to face adversity. She was very close to her father particularly, and often quoted his philosophy of life. Her family was not religious, but they raised her to believe in herself and the reality that under all conditions, one had to be able to respect oneself for one's actions and decisions in life. The families of the victims of the Tree of Life massacre will find within themselves the strength to go on, to give themselves the time to grieve and mourn, and eventually move forward step by step. They have had to face the initial publicity and will again have to face the press and the perpetrator if a trial does occur. We had 2 trials and additional hearings to face over those 30 years, every time dredging up again and again the pain and anger and injustice of the situation. The people of each synagogue will have to decide, as we did, if they can rebuild their home and return to the facility where the actions occurred. Do they want to give the perpetrator the victory of taking away their place of worship? Can the sanctity be restored? Can it be cleaned and restored? Can one return? We stayed in our home. We converted Karen's bedroom into a nursery. We transformed the area of the murder for our new family. Ultimately, we were glad we did not let the killer take from us the home and yard we had loved. We wanted our children to share this space with their sister. It was not always comfortable, but we stayed where, as a family, we experienced happiness, sadness, and happiness again. It held many memories. If you are related to the victims, you will now be associated with them and this event into the future. We are forever marked as the ones whose daughter was murdered. The first few years after she was killed, we got a place outside of Pittsburgh so that we did not feel so conspicuous when out in public. On weekends, we went there with friends and family with whom we could be ourselves. As we got better, we felt almost as though we had to apologize for not seeming to be grieving as much. We felt that people talked about us with the best and most compassionate intentions, but it made us feel self-conscious. People often call me by my daughter's name, which shows they think of the event and her in association with me. Today, this still happens. I had to find the words that felt comfortable when asked by new people I would meet. How many children do you have? When people ask, I pause and say, 1 deceased and 2 living. I could not answer questions simply and be truthful and inclusive. Did I owe an explanation to everyone I would meet in the future? The survivors of the shooting and those related closely to those who died will feel this attachment and label as part of their identity forever. Choosing words carefully to honor those who are gone, deciding whether to say something to strangers is always a challenge. The tenderness one feels on the initial anniversaries becomes easier with experience and acceptance of what happened. Always certain dates, anniversaries, associations trigger a renewal of grief. However, as my wise mother and father said, you will get through it. You will learn better coping skills. You will learn how to live with this trauma, forever changed, but knowing that your loved ones live on through you and all who remember him or her. Finding a way to honor the life of the loved one who was killed is important. Establishing something that reflects his or her values and interests helps to give you a sense of purpose for the future. Our daughter loved to read and write, and we supported several literary magazines, and the library at her Jewish day school was named for her. A friend of ours who lost an adult child created a golf tournament in their daughter's honor. Another friend designs cards that raise money for scholarships in memory of her deceased child. Keeping that person in your life, sustaining the memories, honoring how one lived, not how one died, inspires and strengthens. I hope each victim's family member and each friend is fortunate enough to have a support system and the inner strength and resiliency to overcome the shock of October 27th, a date of dread and sadness. I hope, as with my loss and sadness, that each survivor finds the building blocks to go on and honor life with life. So it's not accidental that we ended the book with life, this notion of honoring life with life, and that's very much something we want to emphasize. So I want to thank Rabbi Davis and Liz Rappaport and Bethel Synagogue for hosting us, and we're happy to take questions if Rabbi Davis wants to moderate them. And we hope you understand a little bit of what it's been like for us in Pittsburgh in the last 2 years. You know, unfortunately, people in Pittsburgh have been saying this. I think it's very true, that the gunmen came to one synagogue, the synagogue where my husband is a rabbi. There, I should just explain, there's the Tree of Life building, but 2 other synagogues, Erez New Light and another Dor Hadash, rented space there. So the shooter happened to come to our synagogue, but that doesn't mean that every synagogue isn't a target. And I think, people in synagogues across the country feel the same way. It happened to be one synagogue, but it could have been any of us. So I'm really glad to share what happened to us with members of another synagogue in a place that's very dear to me. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Beth and Eric. And as Beth said, if some would like to ask questions, we have time for a few. Heidi, I see you raising your hand.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Eric and Beth, for reading from this amazing book. I know that we will want to get a copy for our synagogue library, and I'm going to want one for my own personal library. But my question for you is, what place do you think this book has on a bookshelf? Is this a piece of history? Is it a book of psychology of surviving trauma? Is it a book of theology? Is it all of those things? Something else?
Do you want to take that, Eric? Eric is the archivist, so.
In my day job, I run our local Jewish archive. I'm sure you have something equivalent up there. And a big part of the experience of working at a local archive is pushing back against the kind of larger national stories that we have, or finding ways that the local story fits into them. And something that I feel very passionate about is elevating and telling local stories and trying to do it in the most sophisticated and professional way possible and to the highest degree possible. And what Beth and I talked about a lot with this book was a sense that we have that if we do nothing, the story will be told by people outside of our own community. Because that's the way it works, is when there's a big event, people write the story up. And because we live in a world that has a mass media to it, those stories take on the form that they're required to take on for the story that is being told nationally. And that story is important. That story is about anti-Semitism and what we can do about it. It's about gun violence and what we can do about it. And fundamentally, that national story is about a society looking at itself and saying, what's wrong here and what can we do to fix it? But that story is not about people. It's not about individual people. And we felt very strongly that there needed to be a book out that was of exceptionally high quality as we could pull off. And not just the writing should be high quality, but the whole thing should be high quality. It should be a good book. It should be well made. It should have a nice cover to it. And by doing that, we would be rebalancing the conversation. Not saying that the national conversation doesn't matter, just saying that we wouldn't allow people to have only that conversation without also reckoning with the local experience. And so to me, the point of this book is, the phrase I used before is from Cynthia Ozick. She says, you blow in the narrow end of the shofar, and that's how you make a sound, meaning that from your particular experience, you speak to the world. And so what we're telling is we're telling the specific experience of our community, really a small section of our community over these past 2 years. But we hope that because it's a universal experience, this idea of grief and trauma, and also the Jewishness of the book, that it speaks much more broadly than just our own community.
Yeah, I think I'll add, I mean, since I'm glad that Heidi asked that question, since she's a writer. You know, I mean, I think it's all of those things. You know, there's definitely a lot of theology in it. My husband wrote a piece, and another Rabbi Yelkut, as we mentioned, wrote a section called Finding the Vessels, which are his sermons in which he addresses his congregation and, you know, tries to help them think about how to respond. You know, I think, you know, Linda Hurwitz's essay is in a way theology, sort of how to respond to evil. So, but, you know, I think as much as it is theology, and there's poetry in it, and there's writing by academics, I think it's psychology. You know, it's you know, this event happened, and here are all these essays by people, you know, responding to this event, and it's you know, the varieties of ways that people can respond to the event. And I think what was really most heartening to me about it was just, you know, the power of the human spirit in being able to respond. Just there's so many ways to respond to an event like this, and it's really very heartening to see that people are able to get through even the most difficult of circumstances. So I hope that answered your question, Heidi.
Thank you. And you'll see, I think that Liz put in the chat information where you can order the book from. Anyone else like to ask a question? So I'll ask one final question before we conclude, and that is, maybe you can say just a bit about what this was like for you working on the project. Did it feel like it was healing in some way, or did it feel overwhelming to be constantly, working through and hearing these different voices?
Yeah, so I'll take that first, and I'll let Eric respond second, because we have different reactions. I think I'm very satisfied now that we've done it, but no, I wouldn't say it was healing or cathartic. It was definitely difficult, and we were very fortunate that the press gave us deadlines. And one of our writers, Peter Smith, who's a journalist, said the best muse is a deadline, and I think it was. We'd been telling everybody, it took us, we had this idea in February 2019 to do this. I had an idea for a different kind of anthology. Eric said, let's focus on local history. But I think right around a year ago, we kind of started speaking to people more directly and saying, we want to do this, think about what you want to write, and we'll just let you know when we have a publisher what the deadlines are going to be. And then when we went to the publisher in January, they were really interested, and we set all the deadlines right away so that it could come out now for the second anniversary or the second commemoration of the shooting. And, it's definitely very heavy to be immersed in it, and especially now that the book is coming out, and we're involved in doing events and speaking to people that want to interview us about it. It feels very heavy, but I think I'm satisfied that the pain that we're going through is something that I think can help other people. We went through all this because we wanted to create something that other people could read and respond to, and that would mean something to them and help them in some way. So when people, I went to shul yesterday. I usually go to my husband's shul, which is very small. We hopefully get a minyan, but I went to a shul yesterday where there were 80 people there. So it's like a very socially distanced. The service was 2 hours flat, but I think it's the first time on the high holidays we had in Zoom service along with in person, and we had about 30 people. So I think it's the biggest indoor synagogue gathering I've been to in months. And someone came up to me and told me she'd been reading the book and it meant something to her. And, so it was one of the first kind of in-person interactions I'd had with someone that isn't my close friend who helped me edit it, or isn't, a family member. And it's very satisfying to know that it's meaningful to people, and it also gives people an opportunity to talk about their reactions to the event and how they felt. That's something I'm finding, is that every time I'm discussing this with someone, they want to say something about their feelings about the day, and kind of whether I like it or not, I'm becoming a receptacle for people's feelings about that. But I'm also gratified that people are able to talk about those feelings, because it's important.
To echo Beth, I found the process to be very overwhelming. And I've thought a lot recently, as now that we're kind of on this next stage of the process, about what that overwhelming part was. At first, I thought it was just dealing with such painful material every day and to have to kind of deal with it on such a nuanced level. But I don't really think that's it, because one of the things I find most remarkable about Judaism is its ability to situate pain and grief in a proper place. So many different things, just like a couple that pop into the top of my head. In the prayers for Shabbat, the prayer of Harachamim, which is for martyrs, comes right before Ashrei. And it's so casual that nobody even thinks about it, the tone shift there. But even little things like the way that we suspend Shiva if it's Yom Tov, you know, that's a moment when we say that you're putting your pain in a particular box, even if it's not sort of comfortable. I think what was so challenging for me was, you know, as a writer, you were working in stories so often, and a story is really about like getting your arms around something. And I've just felt such a visceral rejection of stories ever since this happened, in the sense that anything this big and momentous could possibly be quantified and put down and captured. And the sense that I had was like, you would read one incredible essay after another, and still it didn't capture the like fullness of the experience, because it just can't. And the reason it can't is because the fullness of the experience is the extent of the pain that was caused. And the extent of the pain that was caused is uncapturable. It's just too big. And that's the condemnation to me. That's the ultimate condemnation, is that it's a pain that's too big to describe. And so for me, the sort of satisfaction of the book is knowing that we've opened a door that allows people and gives people permission to tell that. But it's not the full articulation of an experience, because it just can't. So I think like that's the tension for me, is the satisfaction of having helped people, given people permission, but knowing that no matter what we do, we can never really get to the end of it, because it's such a large wound.
Yeah, I'll just say my piece opens, you know, the story begins with not being able to tell the story and ends with a riddle. And, you know, for me, the only way to really capture all this is by speaking in riddles. And I used my essay is called Honey from the Carcass, about Samson's lion. And if you remember in Judges 14, the first time Samson is aware of his strength, he is confronted by a lion, and he realizes he has the ability to kill it, and he does. And a year later, he comes back to that same place and he sees a skeleton there. And the carcass is there, but now it's filled with honey. And you know, in the year that's gone by, bees have come and built a hive there and filled this carcass of the lion with honey. So the carcass is always going to be there, but it's also possible to transform it over time and to find ways to draw the honey out. So for me, one of the things that was really deeply meaningful, our 3 congregants who were killed were all Haftorah readers. So I have taught 2 people, I have a 3rd student now, how to read Haftorah over the last 2 years. And it's not that they're replacing the people that were killed, because they can't be replaced, but they're stepping up to do the things they did. And at the adult bat mitzvah of one of them last January, it turned out, when we looked up, she's a woman in her, I think, late 50s, I'll say, a little older than I am. And when she was growing up, there was not an opportunity for girls to have a bat mitzvah reading from the Haftorah. So we looked up her Hebrew birthday, and it turned out it was actually the same as Rich Gottfried's, the same as one of the people that was killed. It was Shmot. And so when she had her adult bat mitzvah last January, we had a celebration. And you know, the Haftorah of Shmot will always be Rich Gottfried's Haftorah, but now it's also Julie Harris's. And, you know, for me, that was an incredible moment of sweetness, of knowing that just because there's pain doesn't mean there can't be honey and sweetness also. So, you know, I wouldn't say that the book is sweetness. And I think, you know, as Eric said, it feels very deceptive to put something between 2 covers and say, this is it. But I think, you know, Eric said in other places, and I think this is really true, that it's a snapshot of what we are now. You know, we had a certain deadline. This was what we were able to do within that deadline. It's possible we'll do another anthology in another few years, or someone else will do an anthology. You know, we are, you know, think it's really important for as many people as possible to share their stories. There's an oral history project at the Jewish Archive. But, you know, the important thing for now is that we were able to put something together that was something that could be meaningful and hopefully show that honey can come from a carcass also.
Thank you both so much for this gift that deepens our roots. And I'll just conclude at the very beginning of the book. The phrase, of course, comes from The prayer Amalei Rachamim, it includes the names of all those who were killed, and I thought it would be appropriate to mention them as we're approaching the English and then soon the Hebrew Yahrzeit. Joyce Feinberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinovich, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, Irvin Younger. Zichronam Yorcha, may their memories be a blessing.
Hashem Yikom Damam, may God avenge their blood. Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone. Erev Tov.
Thank you.
Erev Tov.